Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into the medieval world, a place where half of daily life was improvised on the spot, and the other half was shaped by someone forgetting something they did centuries earlier. So before we settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy this content. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see the global mix of viewers joining in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey. The medieval town crier wasn't meant to be a full-time job. Originally, he was supposed to deliver a single urgent message, something like, "The mill is on fire," or "Stop throwing rotten fish at the tax collector," and then quietly retreat back into the everyday bustle. But medieval Europe had one major problem. Almost nobody could read. A beautifully handwritten royal decree might as well have been wall art for most people. So towns found a solution. They grabbed the loudest person they could find, handed him a bell, and said, "Just shout everything for us." Temporary, simple, practical. And that's how a one-time messenger turned into the medieval version of a government megaphone. When the crier made his first announcement, people gathered immediately, not because they cared, but because noise attracted medieval peasants like screens attract us today. Once the towns realized this was effective, literacy programs disappeared almost overnight. Suddenly, the crier became responsible for all public information: new laws, market days, lost livestock, visiting merchants, unusual weather. Basically, please boil your water unless you enjoy illness. He didn't just deliver news, he shattered silence permanently. He'd march into the marketplace at sunrise, medieval rush hour, ring a bell loud enough to make infants reconsider their life choices, and shout, hear ye," which basically meant, "Attention citizens, I am now ruining your morning." And the townspeople accepted it. They relied on him. The town crier was their news feed, Siri, emergency alert system, and neighborhood gossip all rolled into one sleep-deprived human. When they thought about replacing him with posted notices, the peasants weren't having it. They didn't want to walk all the way to a board. They didn't want to squint at awkward scribbles, and they certainly didn't want to try reading while juggling 12 potatoes and a chicken. So, the temporary messenger got a uniform, a salary, legal authority, and job security so solid it could survive plagues, famines, and incompetent kings. Some families even turned it into a dynasty. Imagine inheriting the family business of being extremely loud. Ultimately, the town crier endured for centuries because medieval Europe had discovered a truth that still applies today. Why bother reading when a man with a bell can just shout it at you? The medieval solution for losing things was simple: attach a bell. Livestock wandering off? Bell. Children wandering off? Bell. Nobles wanting everyone to notice them? Definitely a bell. Probably several bells. It all started harmlessly enough. Farmers put bells on cows so they wouldn't wander off into the forest and start a new life. Simple, practical, temporary. A small hack to keep track of wandering beef. But medieval Europe had a risky habit. Once something worked once, everyone adopted it immediately and never questioned it again. Bells spread like a medieval fashion virus. Soon, goats had bells, sheep had bells, horses had bells. One chronicler even complained he couldn't sleep because the night air jingled incessantly. Congratulations, you just invented the world's first unwanted notification system. Then, likely a very exhausted parent, said the fateful words, what if we put a bell on the toddler?" And just like that, medieval childcare improved by 20%. You always knew where the little human was, or at least the direction the jingling was fading toward. The problem, of course, was when the toddler realized the bell made noise and started running just to hear it ring, forcing the parent into medieval interval training. But it didn't stop there. Oh no, nobles got involved, and nobles ruined everything by making it fashionable. They began attaching decorative bells to cloaks, boots, belts, hats, and horse harnesses. And in some cases, even on sleeves, because nothing screams, "I'm important," quite like jingling every time you bend your elbow. By the late medieval period, the wealthy had effectively turned themselves into walking wind chimes. Entering court sounded like someone rattling a bag of coins. Stylish? Maybe. Practical? Absolutely not. Try sneaking anywhere when you clatter like an overly dramatic house cat. Then came the jesters, who pushed bells to their extreme. If one bell was good, 2 bells were better. 27 bells? Even better. Every jester's movement sent entire rooms into mild chaos, or complete evacuation. Over time, bells became so commonplace that people forgot they were originally just temporary tracking devices. They morphed into tradition, woven into daily life, fashion, and the medieval soundscape alongside shouting merchants, squawking geese, and some guy coughing ominously in the corner. Bells endured because medieval people grasped a truth modern parents still understand. If it moves and makes noise, at least you know where it is. Bread in medieval Europe wasn't just food. It was breakfast, lunch, dinner, political propaganda, an economic gauge, and occasionally a blunt instrument. Bread ruled everything. So when famine struck, kings and city councils scrambled to issue temporary bread laws. Quick fixes meant to stabilize prices, prevent riots, and make it appear that the government was doing more than arguing about taxes. These laws were supposed to be short-term, emergency measures. Just a few don't charge 12 chickens for a loaf type rules. But medieval governments shared the same flaw as modern ones. Once they made a law, they rarely remembered to undo it. So those temporary bread laws lingered and lingered, becoming permanent parts of medieval life, whether anyone liked it or not. The most famous example was England's assize of bread and ale, a regulation born during food shortages. It ensured bakers couldn't overcharge, shortchange, or scam desperate customers. Reasonable, temporary, and helpful. But the government decided, let's keep this forever, until the end of time, or at least until supermarkets exist. This single temporary law lasted over 600 years, outliving the kings who passed it, the bakers who despised it, and the peasants who pretended not to understand it. The law was so intricate, it almost became comical. It dictated the size of bread, the weight of bread, the price of bread, which ingredients were allowed, which were forbidden, and even how intoxicated the ale merchant could be. Answer: not very. A baker could be fined, humiliated, imprisoned, or subjected to a medieval version of Yelp reviews if their loaf was even slightly underweight. Forget burning down a village. That was practically negotiable. But a light loaf? Straight to jail. Yes, there were actual bread police. They patrolled markets, weighing loaves like medieval personal trainers, ensuring no one cheated. The famine ended, shortages resolved, yet the bread laws lingered, looming over bakers like an overbearing grandmother. Medieval people accepted it because tradition outweighed reason, and because bread riots were genuinely terrifying. Angry mobs armed with stale loaves were not to be trifled with. What began as a temporary rule to prevent chaos became one of Europe's longest-lasting, most micromanaging laws, all because no one wanted to ask, do we still need this? Straw on tavern floors started as one of those quaint, temporary medieval solutions meant to last a single night before disappearing politely into history. Some innkeeper, preparing for a feast or festival, scattered clean straw across the floor to soak up spilled ale, mask questionable smells, and create a rustic, cozy vibe. Guests loved it, or, more accurately, they were too drunk to complain. The innkeeper awoke the next morning, surveyed the aftermath, and realized something miraculous had happened. The straw had absorbed everything: the ale, the mud, the tears, and mysterious puddles no one could identify. It was nature's medieval cleaning hack. All he had to do was rake it up and replace it. A perfect short-term fix. But medieval innkeepers, being medieval, interpreted this as a divine sign. If straw made cleaning easier once, why not always? Why not keep floors perpetually covered in something guests couldn't see through, smell through, or judge too harshly? And so, a temporary decoration turned into a lifestyle choice. Soon, travelers expected taverns to have straw on the floor. Enter a medieval inn with bare wood? Something was wrong. Either you'd wandered into a noble establishment that frowned on fun, or the inn had been recently robbed and the straw taken for warmth. Straw became a defining feature of the tavern experience. Straw became part of the tavern's identity, as essential as the bar itself, the ale, and at least one man in the corner who definitely wasn't sleeping, just resting his eyes. Over time, the straw layer grew thicker. New straw was scattered atop old straw. More drinks spilled. More boots tracked in mud. More arguments ended with overturned tankards. Eventually, tavern floors developed geological layers like an archaeological site, each stratum telling the story of last night's questionable choices. The smell didn't improve, but medieval people were trained professionals at ignoring odors. Their homes reeked of smoke, livestock, sweat, and occasional despair. A little tavern straw scent barely registered on their olfactory scale. Even health inspectors in later centuries complained that straw harbored fleas, spilled ale, and a variety of life choices no broom could rectify. By then, though, it was too late. Straw floors were tradition. You don't argue with tradition, especially while standing in it. So what began as a one-night aesthetic experiment became a continental habit lasting centuries. All because someone once said, just throw some straw on it. Castle kitchens, in theory, were supposed to be carefully designed. After all, the kitchen was one of the most hazardous areas in any medieval stronghold. Open flames, boiling cauldrons, sharp knives, and cooks who had been awake since dawn plotting revenge against underseasoned meat. You'd think architects would approach these spaces with precision. But medieval reality was flexible. Many castle kitchens didn't start with a blueprint. They started with a crisis. Perhaps the original kitchen had burned down. Medieval kitchens were excellent at that. Maybe the castle was under siege and needed a cooking space anywhere that wasn't on fire. Or perhaps the lord suddenly demanded a larger banquet hall for impressing guests, and the kitchen was shoved aside like an unwanted stool. Whatever the reason, temporary kitchens appeared in the strangest locations. A hallway? Sure. A spare chamber? Why not? A room directly next to the latrines? Absolutely disastrous, but repeatedly chosen. The reasoning was always the same. We'll fix it later. Later never came. Once a temporary kitchen started operating, castle life adapted around it. Servants memorized awkward new routes. Fire wardens prayed silently. Architects pretended not to notice. And cooks became experts at navigating spaces that defied every principle of human safety. In some castles, the temporary kitchen ended up far from the dining hall. Servants had to carry trays of boiling stew across courtyards, down staircases, around defensive walls, and past livestock. A medieval obstacle course performed while balancing soup. One misstep, and dinner was ruined, and someone was laid up for 3 months. Other makeshift kitchens had ceilings so low that tall cooks worked permanently hunched, giving future historians the impression that medieval cooks were an entirely different evolutionary branch. Some setups lacked chimneys, so smoke simply filled whatever room had been sacrificed. You can imagine how delightful that was during the lunch rush. But the strangest kitchens were those wedged into gateways or positioned next to the castle's main entrance. Nothing says, "Welcome to my fortress," like the aroma of roasting meat mixed with the loud swearing of overworked kitchen staff. Despite the chaos, people adapted. Castle life adjusted to these odd kitchen placements until they became accepted, permanent features. The emergency improvisation eventually solidified into architecture. And that, truly, is the medieval way. If it works today, it's good enough for the next 200 years. Medieval rulers loved issuing temporary laws. They did so like modern people send impulsive text messages, quickly, often, and without thinking of consequences. A king would wake up, hear that someone's goats had escaped again, scribble a decree on the spot, and declare, "This shall last only until the crisis ends." But medieval crises never truly ended, and neither did the laws. Take, for example, a temporary ban on selling fish on Sundays because the bishop was annoyed by market noise during sermons. What should have lasted a week or two somehow became a regional law that outlasted the church building itself. Or consider a rule forbidding citizens from walking around the castle after dark unless accompanied by a lantern and at least one sober adult. Introduced during a brief crime wave, it remained on the books for centuries. Future generations wondered if medieval night air had once been inherently dangerous. The core problem was that medieval Europe had no delete button. Once a law was written down, it joined the growing family of legal siblings crowding the margins of parchment scrolls. No one wanted to be the official who suggested abolishing an old law. What if it was still important? What if it offended a saint? What if it unleashed chaos, or worse, bureaucracy? Over time, these temporary laws piled up into a chaotic mess. Historians combing through archives today still uncover bizarre rules, like no pigs may enter the marketplace unless wearing a control rope, or citizens shall not throw snowballs at soldiers. The fact that someone felt the need for these laws is both hilarious and slightly alarming. Some laws became so outdated that people forgot why they existed in the first place. Villagers followed them simply because, well, it had always been done that way, even when nobody remembered the reason. And if someone dared to question it, elders responded with the medieval equivalent of, "Don't ask questions, child." Tradition is tradition. The funniest part? Medieval rulers occasionally tried to tidy things up by issuing new temporary laws to fix the old temporary laws, which, unsurprisingly, quickly became additional permanent rules. Legal reform was like attempting to extinguish a fire by tossing parchment at it. In the end, medieval Europe didn't just inherit traditions from its ancestors. It inherited centuries of spontaneously created regulations that refused to die. A temporary decree might vanish overnight, or it could haunt society well into the Renaissance. There was no telling which. Take the moat, that iconic symbol of castle power and dramatic architecture. It wasn't originally part of some grand master plan. Most medieval moats began as hastily dug ditches during emergencies. Picture a worried noble pacing around his fortress, muttering, "Dig something, anything. Just make it harder for enemies to walk toward us with knives." And so peasants grabbed shovels and unwittingly began shaping Europe's future real estate aesthetic. These ditches were meant to slow attackers, not become permanent water hazards. Many weren't even filled with water at first. They were just glorified holes in the ground. But medieval Europe loved turning accidents into tradition. Lords thought, well, the ditch is already here. Why not keep it? Then came a truly revolutionary idea. What if we fill it with water? The next question followed naturally. Where will we get the water? And then, of course, the solution, borrow it from the nearest river. Thus, moats were born, thanks to improvisation, desperation, and minor hydrological theft. The moment a ditch held water, everything changed. Suddenly, the castle looked far more formidable. Visitors saw it and thought, yes, this lord is serious. He has a water-filled barrier. Never mind that the water was often murky, stagnant, and occasionally home to an ecosystem no biologist in their right mind would dare approach. To medieval eyes, it radiated authority. Of course, water-filled moats came with side effects. Mosquitoes celebrated. Local frogs received an unexpected housing upgrade. The castle laundry staff discovered that retrieving garments blown into the moat required both courage and prayer. And every so often, someone attempted to wade across and learned a universal truth. Mud does not care about human dignity. Still, moats worked. They discouraged attackers, slowed siege engines, and made casual strolls toward castle walls feel like an obstacle course designed by someone who personally hated you. Naturally, moats remained even after the emergency ended, even after warfare evolved, and even after cannons rendered walls questionable and moats borderline pointless. Lords kept them because they looked impressive. Some drained the water and transformed their moats into gardens, menageries, or extremely inconvenient walkways, but they refused to fill them in. A temporary ditch dug in panic became one of medieval architecture's most iconic defensive features, all because one noble long ago yelled, "Just dig a hole," and everyone else decided the hole was beautiful. In the medieval world, taverns were the social glue holding communities together. They were the newspaper, the therapy office, the entertainment center, and occasionally the place where you woke up wondering whose boots you were wearing. And because taverns were such essential meeting points, They invented a concept modern humans know very well, the tab. But medieval tabs were never intended to be long-term. The idea was simple. You forgot your coins or didn't feel like trudging home to fetch them, so you told the tavern keeper, "Put it on my account." A harmless, temporary arrangement, friendly and meant to be settled at the end of the week. Except medieval people had the same self-control as modern humans staring at a cheesecake. The tab kept growing. First a few alesh, then a dinner, then another ale because someone insulted your chicken, then a round for everyone because that joke you told clearly deserved celebration. Soon, the debt became so large that paying it off required either divine intervention or an exceptionally profitable harvest season. The tavern keeper, of course, tracked everything with alarming precision. While medieval accounting in general could be described as improvised optimism, tavern ledgers were ironclad. He might forget who owned the sheep, but he never forgot that you owed him 11 alesh, 3 meals, and 1 broken stool from last Thursday. When a customer died, which, in medieval times, happened with cheerful frequency, the tavern keeper simply transferred the tab to the next of kin. Medieval inheritance law was merciless. Land passed to heirs, debts passed to heirs, and yes, tavern tabs passed to heirs too. Imagine inheriting your great-uncle's bar bill and thinking, "I wasn't even born when he bought that soup." Some families carried tavern debts like cursed heirlooms. A young man might declare, "I am finally free to start my life," only for the tavern keeper to appear like a medieval tax spirit and say, "Actually, you owe 6 gallons of ale your grandfather drank during the famine of 1321. Tavern tabs became so ingrained that some villages treated them as unofficial credit systems. People traded, negotiated, and even boasted about their tabs. The most impressive villages owed enough to mortgage a small castle. In the end, the medieval tab endured because it solved a universal problem, wanting ale now and responsibility later. It was a temporary convenience that became a generational institution, a medieval tradition born from thirst and perfected by procrastination. During the medieval winter, survival demanded creativity, determination, and occasionally the willingness to let a chicken sleep in your living room. The original idea was simple and practical. During the coldest months, when temperatures could drop lower than a nobleman's empathy, peasants brought their chickens indoors temporarily to prevent them from freezing to death. After all, a living chicken produced eggs. A frozen one produced only disappointment. This was intended as a seasonal arrangement. 3 months of winter together, then everyone returned politely to their designated living spaces. But medieval humans quickly discovered an unexpected bonus. Chickens indoors meant eggs indoors. No more stumbling into a snowstorm just to see if a hen felt generous. The hen now sat by the hearth like a grumpy, feathered roommate, warming herself and silently judging everyone. Soon, chickens claimed corners of cottages, rearranged straw piles, and strutted around with the confidence of beings who knew they were essential to household survival. The peasants accepted this. They were used to sharing their homes with smoke, tools, children, and occasionally livestock. So a chicken or 3 barely registered as unusual. The problem arose when winter ended and but the chickens didn't want to leave. By spring, many hens had grown accustomed to luxury living. Why return to the drafty coop when the cottage offered warmth, companionship, and unlimited access to fallen crumbs? It didn't take long for peasants to realize that their temporary winter guests had become permanent tenants. Cottage life reorganized itself around them. Families stepped carefully to avoid crushing a half-asleep hen. Meals involved gently shooing chickens away from the table with the same tired sigh used for misbehaving toddlers. Conversations were frequently interrupted by enthusiastic clucking, and every household developed that one chicken who believed she was in charge. Chickens became part of the domestic soundtrack, the crackle of the hearth, the quiet hum of conversation, and the occasional triumphant cackle announcing an egg delivery. Medieval visitors barely noticed. After all, their own cottages were equally chaotic. If anything, a chicken indoors was a sign of prosperity because it wasn't dead. Over generations, the practice became normal. What began as a crisis measure transformed into a charmingly chaotic tradition. Cottages became miniature farms, and chickens became unofficial members of the family. In the end, medieval people didn't just adapt to having chickens indoors, they embraced it. And honestly, the chickens did too. In the early medieval world, most people didn't have surnames. Villages were small, nobody moved far, and everyone knew each other's business anyway. If you said John, everyone knew which John you meant, usually from context or scandal. But as populations grew, medieval society faced a problem: too many Johns. The solution? Temporary nicknames. A quick descriptor to distinguish people: John the Baker, John the Tall, John the Quiet, John who smells faintly of fish. These labels were meant to be casual, flexible, and expendable, used for a season, maybe a lifetime, but certainly not forever. And then medieval bureaucracy entered the scene. When governments began recording taxes, property, and legal disputes, scribes needed identifiers. They couldn't write John, the one who lives sort of near the well, but not too close because of that incident. So they used whatever nickname the community already had for him. Once written down, the name became official. Once official, it became hereditary. And that's why, hundreds of years later, completely ordinary families walk around with names like Short, Long, Armstrong, Swift, Brown, Cook, Fisher, and Baker. Names that began as quick labels, shouted across muddy streets, and were never meant to last forever. Some medieval nicknames were flattering. Most were not. Imagine being called John the Bald for a single winter while your hair grew back, only for your descendants 500 years later to sign checks as Mr. Bald. Or consider William Crooked Nose, whose family probably wished medieval scribes had taken the day off when that name was recorded. Then there are surnames like Folks, Stout, Pepper, Fox, and Goodman, names that hint at personality traits, professions, local jokes, or unfortunate incidents no modern family remembers, but definitely happened. The funniest cases are surnames that freeze one single moment in time, like a medieval screenshot. Someone slipped in the mud, chased a goat, or burned a batch of bread, and now their descendants are forever defined by the fallout of that moment. That's not a surname. That's cosmic comedy. By the late Middle Ages, surnames were permanent. Temporary nicknames had transformed into full-blown identities. The medieval world turned fleeting jokes into genealogical destiny, and honestly, that might be the most medieval thing of all. Medieval Europe did not plan its roads. Planning implies intention, foresight, meetings, diagrams, and at least one person saying, "Let's not do this terribly." Medieval roads, on the other hand, happened because enough people repeatedly walked through the same muddy field until a trench formed, and everyone collectively decided, "Ah yes, this is the road." Originally, these paths weren't meant to last. They were temporary shortcuts made during seasonal changes. Farmers taking a quicker route during harvest, shepherds guiding animals around flooded meadows, merchants trying to avoid whatever wolf haunted the main path. These routes were improvised, accidental, and profoundly unsuitable for long-term use. But medieval society had one rule: if something worked once, it would be used forever. Permanence by laziness. Soon, entire communities adopted these muddy trenches as main roads. No paving, no gravel, not even an attempt to flatten the earth. Just a line of churned soil carved by human feet, horse hooves, cartwheels, and the occasional confused goose. Then came the rain. Rain was the mortal enemy of medieval travel. A light drizzle could turn a road into a swamp. A full storm could transform it into something resembling bread dough. Carts got stuck. Horses sank. People lost shoes so often that finding footwear in the mud had essentially become a neighborhood pastime. Medieval chroniclers describe roads as deep, treacherous, or impossible, which is a polite way of saying, do not attempt unless you enjoy suffering. Yet no one fixed them. Why? Because maintenance required effort, effort required organization, and organization required someone in charge. Medieval villages were masters at avoiding all three. The crown occasionally decreed, henceforth, all towns shall repair their roads. and towns responded with the medieval equivalent of polite nods and complete inaction. Over time, these temporary mud trails became so entrenched that maps recorded them, merchants depended on them, armies marched along them, and no one remembered they weren't meant to be permanent. Travelers described journeys as spiritual trials, which, in historian speak, translates to, "I never want to see mud again." By the time proper paving arrived centuries later, some roads had been muddy for so long that people almost considered the mud sacred. It had heritage, tradition, and character. A temporary shortcut had become a medieval highway, and every traveler suffered for it. Medieval battles were chaotic, loud, dusty, and full of people wearing helmets that made it impossible to tell friend from foe. Commanders came up with a simple, temporary solution: a flag, a bright and recognizable piece of cloth held high above the fray to signal, "If you're on this side, don't stab anyone under this banner." That was it. No symbolism, no pride, no national identity, just a medieval version of a team jersey, only significantly flappier. Yet, as always, medieval people refused to let a temporary idea remain temporary. A flag that survived one battle, usually by sheer luck, was considered heroic. Soldiers adored it. Commanders insisted on reusing the same one. Soon, the temporary banner transformed into an emotional support cloth that people were willing to die for. If the flag got lost in battle, it became a national tragedy. Chroniclers described its loss with the same grief reserved for natural disasters. Losing a flag was like losing a beloved relative, except the relative was made of linen and had never contributed to family gatherings. Then came the upgrades. Nobles began decorating their flags with symbols, animals, mottos, and colors meant to inspire troops, though half the soldiers were illiterate and the other half colorblind. Despite the harsh realities of medieval life, disease, famine, and the occasional unexpected goat attack, battlefield banners slowly evolved into works of art far too precious for the chaos of war. Still, nobles insisted on bringing them to battles. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps superstition, or perhaps a subtle desire to watch them wave heroically while archers rained arrows nearby. Some banners achieved legendary status, not because of bravery or clever design, but simply because they survived. Imagine, if you will, a scrap of cloth that endured 2 full-scale wars, 3 sieges, and one particularly dramatic thunderstorm that flattened several tents and terrified a nobleman into thinking the apocalypse had arrived. To the medieval mind, survival was divine approval. "This banner cannot fall." People cried, as if the piece of linen itself had secured a permanent plot armor, shielding it from arrows, fire, and the clumsy hooves of rampaging horses. And every time the banner survived a skirmish or siege, its reputation grew exponentially, like yeast left unattended in a warm cellar. Soldiers adored it, commanders insisted on reusing it, and before anyone realized it, the simple battlefield marker, a flag designed merely to indicate, "Do not stab anyone under this," transformed into an object of emotional reverence. Losing one in battle was comparable to losing a favorite uncle who, while slightly annoying, had always handed out coins and told amusing stories at Christmas. Chroniclers described missing banners with the same sorrow they used for natural disasters, as if linen, somehow, held the weight of civilization itself. Naturally, nobles couldn't resist embellishing these flags. Symbols were added. Animals were depicted charging heroically, swords were painted to look sharp, and mottos appeared in fancy lettering, though roughly half of the soldiers were illiterate and the other half colorblind. Despite this, the banners became iconic, symbols not merely of the army, but of kingdoms, identities, and entire cultures. What began as a practical "don't stab here" tool became the precursor to every national flag, coat of arms, and ceremonial standard that later generations would revere. The irony is staggering. Most of the flags people today regard as sacred, philosophical, and deeply symbolic started simply because someone needed a big, visible stick to prevent friendly fire. A temporary battlefield hack accidentally became the logo of civilization itself. The medieval obsession with temporary solutions turning permanent did not stop at flags. Feast days, for example, began as rare, fleeting celebrations. Originally, they were designed to honor a new saint, commemorate a miracle, or simply distract villagers from the fact that winter had lingered for 7 months and morale was low. A feast day was supposed to be a delightful exception, a few hours of singing, meat, ale, and mild chaos. In a world where plumbing was a myth and bread was considered mildly exciting. Yet, humans being humans, they quickly discovered that feast days were far superior to work days. Once a village experienced a feast that didn't devolve into total disaster, meaning the ale didn't run out, no one lost an eye to a swinging roasting spit, and at least some music was pleasant, everyone agreed it must be repeated. And repeat they did. Word spread from village to village, and suddenly, one successful feast inspired another. The church, ever eager to sanctify human enjoyment and adore saints in equal measure, happily approved more celebrations. The medieval calendar soon resembled a child's notebook, chaotic, overfilled, and decorated with scribbles that made sense only to those living in the village at the time. Feast days multiplied. Saints' birthdays, saints' deaths, saints' cousins' miracles, minor local saints whose stories were never entirely recorded, and bizarre commemorations that involved bread, cows, or the occasional plague-warding ritual. Some villages celebrated Saint Who Stopped the Cow Day. Others commemorated a saint who allegedly saved a loaf of bread. Details were tragically lost over time, but the feasts endured. On paper, peasants were supposed to labor most days of the year. In reality, depending on the region, up to a third of the calendar was consumed by feasts, half-feasts, pre-fasts, and post-feasts. One might wake up intending to harvest barley, only to discover it was Saint Someone or Other's Day, requiring compliance with sacred tradition, socialize, drink, sing, perhaps chase a goat if one wandered into the square. Kings occasionally protested, trying to curb the feast day glut to improve productivity, only to attend enthusiastically when invited. Priests attempted moderation, often ending up hosting the most extravagant festivities. Hypocrisy, it seems, was a feature, not a bug. By the late Middle Ages, Europe was awash in feasts, and no one remembered which were originally temporary celebratory interruptions. A single event meant to lift spirits had become a permanent excuse to avoid work, embraced wholeheartedly by medieval people and enforced by collective enjoyment. This pattern of temporary becoming permanent extended even to hairstyles. Medieval coiffures were not the product of subtlety, taste, or restraint. They were accidents, experiments, or desperate improvisations elevated to fashion through sheer social momentum. Take the infamous tonsure, for instance. Monks shaved the tops of their heads ostensibly to symbolize humility. Realistically, it probably began when one monk botched a haircut, panicked, and declared, "It is holy now." Rather than correct the mistake, monasteries embraced it, producing thousands of startled-looking men who projected solemnity and eternal surprise. Then there were noble women with shaved foreheads, a trend that began as a brief attempt to make the forehead appear larger, a beauty ideal of the time. One fashion-forward noblewoman likely tried it to hide a disastrous haircut or as a joke, and suddenly half the continent was plucking and shaving foreheads as if auditioning to become human medieval lamps. Temporary fad? Certainly. Did it last a century? Tragically, yes. Other hairstyles proliferated through social pressure. Imagine a duke arriving at court with hair sprouting in two tufts like horns, shaped into elaborate cones, or styled with curls requiring scaffolding to maintain. Courtiers laughed, imitated, and exaggerated, ensuring the trend spread. In essence, medieval Europe was a place where the accidental, the temporary, and the chaotic routinely hardened into permanent institutions. A flag surviving a battle became a national emblem. A feast day designed to lift morale became a cornerstone of social life. A botched haircut inspired a continent-wide fashion. These were societies that embraced improvisation, celebrated accidents, and insisted that once a thing worked, even accidentally, it deserved to endure. Medieval fashion, much like the rest of life in those chaotic centuries, often operated under the principle that if it exists and looks ridiculous, insist it's stylish, and everyone else will comply. The Duke, for instance, might appear at court with a hairstyle that resembled two woolly goats attempting to escape from his head simultaneously. To the untrained eye, this was absurd, impractical, and possibly dangerous in a windstorm. Yet, because the Duke held the power to grant titles, confiscate lands, and generally ruin anyone's day with a single frown, the entire noble class followed suit. Within months, half the court resembled a forest fire caught in a stiff breeze. Fashion, they reminded themselves, was subjective. Ridiculous, maybe, but clearly authoritative. Practical disasters frequently became style statements as well. Consider the knight returning from a battle, helmet crushed, hair plastered in blood, sweat, and questionable debris from his own armor. Instead of lamenting his appearance, he announced to the court, in a voice pitched somewhere between heroic and panicked, "Behold, this is the latest style." Other knights, perhaps equally exhausted and desperate for any form of validation, immediately adopted the trend. Soon, groups of knights strutted through towns, hair twisted and tufted as if each individual had fought the wind itself and lost. And so, temporary chaos became permanent fashion. The fascinating part of medieval trends was their stubborn longevity. Hairstyles that began as a joke, an accident, or sheer negligence became codified, immortalized in manuscript illustrations, and celebrated as tradition. Courtiers defended them. Artists exaggerated them. Entire generations followed them, not out of taste, but because social momentum had declared it so. A hairstyle intended to last a single weekend could persist for decades, a living testament to the medieval capacity for collective stubbornness. In a world without mirrors, or where mirrors existed only for the wealthiest few, bad hair days became culture. Not merely a personal misfortune, but a communal aesthetic to be endured, copied, and occasionally worshipped. This principle of accidental permanence extended far beyond personal grooming. Medieval cities did not grow through careful planning, logical design, or civil engineering principles. They grew through sheer improvisation and human laziness. A temporary shelter erected by workers fixing a castle wall might become a village over the course of decades simply because no one ever dismantled it. A group of masons arrives to repair the outer fortifications, sets up small wooden huts to house themselves, intending only to stay a few weeks. They are joined by carpenters, blacksmiths, and occasionally a wandering apothecary who smells faintly of herbs and despair. Merchants see an opportunity and build stalls nearby. Families of laborers arrive, construct slightly sturdier dwellings, and inevitably a blacksmith appears, following the workers like a medieval food truck. Except instead of serving food, he hammers metal, shouts occasionally, and occasionally sets things on fire. By the time the local lord notices, he's confronted with a sprawling settlement that wasn't exactly authorized, but seems impressively productive. A casual declaration of "excellent, a new district, I shall be raising rent," is all it takes to legitimize what began as temporary wooden shacks. Over decades, timber-framed homes replaced the original huts. Dirt paths harden into roads. Walls appear. Taverns spring up because medieval people never built anything without immediately providing a tavern. By the time any official realizes the permanent settlement exists, generations of families already call it home. Children have been born there, small livestock have wandered and died, and traditions, born entirely out of improvised necessity, have begun to crystallize. Some of Europe's most famous districts began precisely this way. Temporary, unauthorized, accidental communities that refuse to vanish. Urban planners today look at winding, chaotic streets and exclaim, "Why does it twist like a panicked snake?" The answer, invariably, is that it wasn't meant to be a street at all. It was the path between two temporary huts, and nobody bothered to straighten it for 800 years. Amid these improvisations, royal families faced far more intentional, but no less chaotic transformations. Mary Tudor entered the world on a cold February morning in 1516, a long-awaited daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. Unlike the countless miscarriages her mother endured, Mary survived, bright-eyed, intelligent, and startlingly aware, even as an infant, that her place in the world was precarious. The court immediately noted her brilliance and potential. She learned Latin faster than most children learned table manners, mastered the virginals with a poise that would shame adults, and carried herself with a calm dignity that forced adults, king, courtiers, and visiting ambassadors alike, to stand straighter in her presence. For a brief period, Mary lived the life of a cherished princess, adored as a symbol of hope and continuity. Her father, Henry VIII, showed her affection openly, parading her before ambassadors as proof of divine favor, while her mother provided steadfast guidance and instilled in her a strong sense of duty and faith. But the shadows were never far. Henry's desperation for a male heir, combined with the repeated tragedies of Catherine's pregnancies, began to corrode the environment around Mary. Her early childhood was marked by uncertainty, as the court whispered about theological loopholes, potential annulments, and rising tensions within Bullen. As Mary grew, she witnessed the collapse of her family's stability firsthand. She saw her mother exiled from court, barred from even speaking with her daughter. She observed in Bullen ascend to favor and power, and she gradually understood that love at the Tudor court was conditional, strategic, and painfully negotiable. Mary's devotion to her mother and her piety made her an obstacle in Henry's schemes. By the time she reached adolescence, she was no longer a celebrated princess, but a political inconvenience, a living symbol of a rival claim, and a child navigating a world where familial loyalty could be weaponized against her. Her fall from favor was not instantaneous. It was a slow, bruising erosion of status and identity, each day layered with humiliation. When Henry VIII officially separated from Catherine, Mary's title shifted from Lady Princess to merely Lady Mary, a carefully chosen reminder of her altered status. The court's treatment of her changed overnight from reverent respect to polite, distant acknowledgement. Worse still, she was forbidden from seeing her mother. Letters, smuggled like contraband, became lifelines filled with guidance, affection, and spiritual counsel. Mary obeyed her mother's instructions with resolute faith, even though doing so placed her in direct tension with her father's authority. Mary became a symbol, a living reminder of a marriage and legitimacy that the king now denied. And Bullen, reportedly, harbored a mixture of political suspicion and personal animosity, viewing Mary as an obstacle to her own lineage. The young Tudor princess was thrust into a dangerous political cold war she neither asked for nor could escape. Then, in 1536, the blow Mary had feared arrived, her mother's death. Catherine died isolated, weakened by illness, and steadfast in faith, leaving Mary with a mixture of grief, guilt, and helplessness. Her world contracted once again, removing the one anchor she had relied upon, and forcing her to navigate the treacherous Tudor court alone. By the time Bullen met her spectacular, tragic end later that same year, the court had held its collective breath and watched as one of Henry VIII's most flamboyant experiments in marriage and ambition ended in execution. Mary Tudor, long a witness to her father's manipulations and the relentless tides of courtly fortune, felt little satisfaction in Anne's fall. The court, predictably, attempted to use the moment as a wedge, coaxing her toward reconciliation with her father. Courtiers leaned forward, whispering in her ear that she should accept the king's conditions, sign documents confirming her own illegitimacy, and acknowledge the annulment of her mother's marriage. The irony was as bitter as gall. Survival, Mary realized, often required one to disavow one's own family, to erase the painful truth and sign it away on parchment. Mary, already hardened by years of emotional exile, loss, and humiliation, signed the humiliating statements demanded of her, not because she accepted their validity, far from it, but because she understood instinctively that a refusal would have cost her far more than dignity. She chose life. In that moment, The young princess demonstrated the kind of pragmatic courage that would define her reign decades later. With and gone, and Jane Seymour ascending as the king's consort, Mary glimpsed a narrow, flickering light at the end of a tunnel that had been darkened for years. Jane, unlike and possessed a genuine capacity for empathy, a trait rare in the Tudor court. Quietly, carefully, and at times with bold interventions, she worked to ease the tensions between father and daughter, guiding the two estranged figures toward a fragile reconciliation. This delicate restoration of familial relations required more than Jane's kindness. Diplomacy was intricate, and the pressure from Charles V's envoys was constant. Eventually, Henry relented, permitting Mary to return to court, but only under stringent terms. She was allowed to enter the royal household once again, but only after signing away her birthright in the most humiliating fashion possible, acknowledging her parents' marriage as unlawful and her own status as illegitimate. To most, such terms would have broken the spirit entirely. Mary, however, had learned early that survival was often a matter of compromise, and compromise sometimes required swallowing pride in monumental quantities. She accepted the arrangement, weary from grief but determined to continue living on her own terms, even within the constraints imposed by her father. Her return to court was bittersweet. Henry VIII, in a style both domineering and capricious, greeted her with what appeared to be warmth, as though the estrangement of previous years had been a mere trifle, a minor irritant now conveniently forgotten. This was Henry's method. Pain was ephemeral, and he expected his subjects to act as though suffering inflicted by royal authority were instantly nullified. Mary, for her part, resumed her place at court, smiling, obeying, and fulfilling the outward expectations of a Tudor daughter, while internally carrying a complex tapestry of scars. The abandonment she had endured, the humiliation of forced submission, and the deep spiritual ache of having betrayed her mother's memory. It was Jane Seymour who softened the environment for her. Mary developed a sincere affection for Jane, the only one among Henry's wives who treated her not as a political obstacle or a reminder of illegitimacy, but as a young woman of intellect, resilience, and personal merit. Mary's brief experience of family warmth was strengthened by the birth of her half-brother, Edward VI. Holding the fragile infant in her arms, Mary permitted herself a rare moment of hope. Perhaps, she thought, a restored family bond was possible. Perhaps, in time, the court could be a place of relative stability. However, stability in the Tudor court was always fleeting. Jane Seymour's death shortly after childbirth shattered Mary's renewed sense of security. The court plunged into new turbulence as Henry remarried 3 more times, each queen bringing unique political challenges. And of Cleves, politically safe but socially awkward, required careful navigation. Catherine Howard, young, impulsive, and dangerously reckless, injected chaos into the court. Catherine Parr, intelligent and reform-minded, provoked ideological conflict, particularly around Protestant reform, which Mary viewed with horror. In all of this, Mary's position remained precarious. She walked a delicate line between obedience and resistance, her unwavering Catholic faith non-negotiable even as the kingdom shifted toward Protestant policies under her father's changing whims. Mary's adulthood was defined by vigilance. Though restored to favor, she was tolerated rather than trusted. Welcomed in appearances, she was surveilled in practice. Any deviation from expected behavior could have catastrophic consequences. She learned, early and emphatically, that Henry's approval was volatile, fleeting, and capable of transforming into wrath in an instant. The lesson was clear. Survival in the Tudor court required not only resilience, but a sharp understanding of the balance between obedience and personal integrity. When Henry VIII died in 1547, Mary was 31, an age dangerously close to what the Tudors considered permanent spinsterhood. She had endured 6 royal marriages, religious upheaval, public humiliation, and enough trauma to have crushed a lesser spirit. The crown passed instead to her 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI, whose advisors were radical Protestants viewing Mary's steadfast Catholicism as both a political threat and a personal affront. Despite her royal status, she suddenly found herself vulnerable. Her properties were monitored, her religious observances restricted, and her household infiltrated by spies loyal to Edward's counsel. Pressure to abandon her faith was relentless. Mary's refusal was absolute, anchored in an unshakable conviction that religion was not merely a private preference, but the core of her identity. Mary's defiance, firm and deliberate, exacerbated tensions with Edward. To him, her persistence was rebellion. To her, it was survival, faith, and a claim to legitimacy that could not be compromised. Their exchanges, when they met, were bitter and charged with the weight of impending mortality. Edward's death in 1553 brought these tensions to a dramatic apex. A desperate faction, led by the Duke of Northumberland, attempted a coup, crowning Lady Jane Grey as queen in an effort to bypass Mary's legitimate claim. They counted on Mary's isolation and presumed unwillingness to mobilize support. Mary, however, had endured far worse than political scheming. She acted decisively, gathering supporters and raising an army that quickly surpassed the size and strength of Northumberland's forces. Her cause attracted not only Catholics, but also those loyal to the principle of dynastic legitimacy. To the kingdom, she represented continuity, stability, and lawful succession. Her march to London was a triumph of both strategy and symbolic power. The rightful Tudor line would not be displaced by the machinations of opportunists. Within 9 days, Lady Jane Grey's short-lived reign collapsed, and Mary entered the capital triumphant, yet acutely aware of the immense responsibilities now resting upon her shoulders. Mary's ascension in 1553 was heralded with joyous spectacle. Crowds thronged the streets, bells rang across the city, and bonfires illuminated the night in celebration. After decades of humiliation, marginalization, and exile within her own kingdom, Mary Tudor stood at the pinnacle of power. Yet, even as triumph washed over her, she recognized the profound challenges that lay ahead. The crown did not erase old wounds, nor guarantee loyalty. It brought with it immediate and urgent questions of religious policy, governance, and succession. Mary's vision was clear. She would restore Catholicism to England, not as a gentle recommendation, but as a moral imperative, believing firmly that her survival and ascension were guided by divine purpose. However, her path was complicated by her lack of an heir. At 37, childless and unmarried, Mary faced the pressing reality that without progeny, her religious and political reforms could collapse after her death. Advisors, ambassadors, and courtiers understood the stakes. If Mary failed to produce a child, Elizabeth, her Protestant half-sister, would inherit, potentially reversing all her achievements overnight. To Mary, the solution was straightforward: marriage, and a union that could ensure the security of her realm, her faith, and the continuation of the Tudor Catholic legacy. The question of marriage divided the court. Some advocated for an English nobleman, a match that might reassure subjects wary of foreign influence. Mary, however, guided by her mother's Spanish lineage and her own devout Catholic convictions, looked to the continent for a partner whose dynastic and religious credentials were impeccable. Philip of Spain, son of Charles V and heir to the vast Spanish Habsburg Empire, represented both a political alliance and a spiritual reinforcement of Mary's mission. To Mary, Philip was providential, a partner chosen not merely by diplomacy, but by God's design. To her subjects, however, he represented foreign dominance, Spanish entanglement, and the unsettling possibility of England subsumed under Habsburg influence. Mary Tudor's coronation and subsequent marriage plans illustrate the precarious balance between personal conviction, political necessity, and public perception. Crowds celebrated, bells rang, and yet beneath the festivities lay a current of suspicion and fear. England's memory of foreign interference was long, and Philip's arrival, heralded as a means of securing Mary's Catholic restoration, was perceived by many as a looming threat of domination. Mary's triumph was immediate and undeniable, yet she understood that her journey was only beginning. The crown provided power, but not certainty. Her faith, her legitimacy, and the future of the Tudor Catholic vision all depended on her ability to navigate the turbulent waters ahead, balancing divine purpose with the ever-shifting currents of courtly politics. By the time Philip of Spain made his way to England in the heat of midsummer 1554, Mary Tudor had spent her life anticipating this moment in ways that went far beyond political calculation. For decades, she had endured exclusion, the constant fear of her father's wrath, and the humiliating degradation of public illegitimacy. The promise of Philip's arrival was meant to solidify her rule, strengthen Catholicism in the kingdom, and, perhaps most importantly, secure the succession she had been denied since birth. In her mind, the marriage was a divine alignment, a union ordained by God to restore England to spiritual and political stability. Yet the kingdom did not share her certainty. England had long memories of foreign intervention, of rulers who allowed themselves to be puppeteered by distant crowns. Philip, son of Charles V and heir to the vast Habsburg Empire, represented not merely a political alliance, but the potential for domination from abroad. Many of the nobility, even those loyal to Mary, recoiled at the notion of his influence. They feared the familiar specter of a foreign power dictating English affairs, drawing the country into continental wars in which England had no stake. These fears were not entirely unfounded. Philip's Spanish retainers demanded resources, taxes, and military commitments. The crown could barely resist being drawn into conflicts that belonged to the Spanish sphere. Mary, however, regarded such apprehensions as trivial. She trusted Philip implicitly, seeing him as both a partner in faith and a guarantor of her dynastic legitimacy. The more resistance mounted, the firmer she became in her resolve. Mary's determination was misunderstood. While she sought a union that balanced personal companionship with political necessity, her subjects viewed it as a threat. By early 1554, tensions reached a breaking point. Wyatt's rebellion erupted, led by Sir Thomas Wyatt and a coalition of English gentry determined to prevent Mary's marriage to Philip. Some factions even entertained the idea of placing her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth on the throne in her stead. Though the rebellion ultimately collapsed, its shockwaves rattled Mary profoundly. She had expected debate, perhaps parliamentary resistance, but nothing prepared her for armed men marching toward London with the explicit goal of seizing power. Mary responded with remarkable fortitude. At Guildhall, in front of assembled citizens and courtiers, she declared unequivocally that she would die a queen rather than surrender her authority. Her words carried a force rarely witnessed in Tudor England. The speech was not mere rhetoric. It was a public assertion of her legitimacy and a demonstration of courage that even her detractors could not entirely dismiss. Yet Wyatt's insurrection left deep scars. Suspicion flourished. Elizabeth, her sister and political rival, became a figure of scrutiny, her movements and intentions constantly questioned. Mary learned a harsh truth. Her subjects did not necessarily share her vision, nor did they instinctively trust her judgment. Nevertheless, the Queen pressed forward. In July 1554, Philip arrived in England. Mary, with heart brimming with hope and anxiety, welcomed him as the man who would secure her throne, her faith, and her lineage. In her imagination, the marriage would be an alliance of hearts as well as dynasties, a partnership in devotion and governance that would produce heirs to fortify the Tudor line. Years of isolation, neglect, and emotional deprivation had left her craving affection almost as urgently as she needed a successor. To her, the marriage was the culmination of every prayer whispered in the dark hours of childhood and adolescence. Philip, however, viewed the union through a far more pragmatic lens. At 27, 11 years her junior, he had been raised in the intricate and often coldly strategic Habsburg court. His prior marriage, subsequent widowhood, and upbringing amidst the machinations of European politics had taught him that matrimony was primarily an instrument of statecraft, not romance. Contemporary accounts describe him as courteous, even attentive, but never genuinely invested in his bride beyond the demands of duty. Letters to his father, Emperor Charles V, make clear that Philip perceived his English marriage as an obligation to be fulfilled rather than a personal joy to embrace. Mary, however, misinterpreted his restrained politeness as warmth. She was captivated by his regal bearing, his devotion to Catholicism, his refined continental mannerisms. For a woman who had grown accustomed to deprivation, of love, of attention, of parental approval, Philip's presence must have seemed a long-awaited affirmation of her worth. She fell deeply, desperately in love, pouring into him hopes she had carried for decades. Philip, for his part, found England foreign, chilly, and hostile, a land where he struggled to communicate and navigate a complex, suspicious nobility. Parliamentary limitations ensured that he wielded little real power, reinforcing his detachment. Mary's affection intensified in proportion to his emotional distance, a dynamic that would haunt the remainder of their union. Then, in the late months of 1554, Mary noticed the unmistakable signs she had longed for her entire life. Her menstruation ceased, her body swelled, her senses attuned to the rhythms midwives and physicians recognized as indicators of pregnancy. The court's physicians confirmed what she wanted desperately to believe. Preparations began almost immediately. Rooms were furnished, cradles carved, proclamations drafted, and Parliament debated contingency plans for the potential governance of Philip as regent. The realm collectively anticipated the birth of a Catholic heir, a child whose existence would cement the Tudor line and unify England in religious and political allegiance. Mary herself regarded the signs as divine vindication. Her joy, however, was tragically illusory. Today, historians believe that Mary suffered from pseudocyesis, a phantom pregnancy precipitated by intense psychological and physiological stress. Trauma, isolation, and the overwhelming desire for motherhood combined to deceive her body into mimicking every symptom of pregnancy except the one that mattered: the presence of a developing child. Physicians, courtiers, and even Mary herself were convinced, each reading the signs in good faith. Preparations proceeded with meticulous care, yet the truth lay hidden beneath the layers of expectation and hope. Spring of 1555 saw Mary retreating into confinement, as was customary for a queen nearing labor. The court waited, Europe watched, and Mary counted the days with mounting anticipation. Yet the labor pains never arrived. Summer passed, and whispers began to circulate. Had the queen deceived her subjects? Was divine wrath at play? Had some malformation or miscarriage occurred in secret? Mary refused to abandon hope. She clung to the signs, the swelling, the nausea, and the subtle movements she misinterpreted as life within her womb. But the cruel reality gradually imposed itself. There was no child. The devastation was profound. For Mary, the loss represented not just a personal betrayal, but a public humiliation, the collapse of a dream she had cultivated for decades. Philip, too, receded, occupied with continental obligations and less motivated by the emotional tragedy unfolding in England than Mary's devotion required. Their marriage, fragile at the outset, strained under the weight of loss, disappointment, and misunderstanding. In 1557, history repeated itself. Mary, older, weakened, and emotionally exhausted, once again believed herself pregnant. Courtiers offered cautious congratulations, physicians confirmed the signs, and anticipation swelled. Yet once again, the illusion collapsed. This second phantom pregnancy marked the beginning of Mary's physical decline. Symptoms mirrored true gestation but masked serious underlying illness, speculated by historians to be ovarian cysts, uterine cancer, or another reproductive condition that sapped her strength. Concurrently, the Marian persecutions, later immortalized as the Marian burnings, cast a dark shadow over her reign. Mary perceived them as a moral imperative, a restoration of spiritual order, while her subjects experienced fear, trauma, and the flames of enforced orthodoxy. The combination of political pressure, personal grief and deteriorating health left her increasingly isolated. Military setbacks compounded her suffering. The loss of Calais, England's last possession in France, struck a blow that resonated not only in political terms, but in the very fiber of Mary's identity. Reportedly, she mourned deeply, saying, "Calais, you are engraved upon my heart," though whether these words were ever spoken aloud remains debated. The sentiment, however, captures the profound weight of defeat in a life already laden with disappointment, betrayal, and unfulfilled hopes. By the closing months of 1558, Mary Tudor's life had been reduced to a slow, aching decline. Bedridden, feverish, and increasingly aware of her own mortality, the once vibrant queen who had fought and endured more than most could imagine now confronted the quiet, unyielding certainty of death. Her body weakened by illness, her spirit burdened with decades of betrayal, she faced the ultimate reality. Her time was short. In those final hours, Mary made the decision that must have been among the most painful of her long life. She formally recognized her younger sister, Elizabeth, as the rightful heir to the English throne. For Mary, this was a bitter concession. Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn, represented everything Mary had fought against: the religious reforms, the Protestant ascendancy, and a repudiation of the faith and traditions Mary had dedicated herself to preserving. Yet she knew that she had no choice. England needed a smooth transition, however distasteful that prospect seemed to her. On November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor passed away, aged just 42. Alone, childless, and deprived of the family she had longed for, she departed a world that had never fully understood or appreciated her. History, as it often does, remembered her harshly. The moniker Bloody Mary obscured the complexities of her character. The devout woman, shaped by trauma, driven by faith, and haunted by the love and children she had never been granted. Beneath the crown lay a queen who had endured humiliation, loss, political machinations, and personal grief with courage that few could match. Her story was one of devotion and suffering, of hope repeatedly dashed, and of steadfastness in the face of relentless adversity. While England mourned, or perhaps feared, the passing of Mary Tudor, thousands of miles away, another young conqueror was contemplating the very different but equally formidable burdens of power. By 324 BCE, Alexander of Macedon had achieved a level of dominance few rulers could ever dream of attaining. His conquest stretched from the rugged mountains of Greece to the banks of the Indus River, an expanse so vast that even his most trusted generals struggled to imagine its boundaries. The cities he toppled, the kings he dethroned, and the empires he shattered became tales that would echo for centuries. Victory followed him like a shadow, and his charisma left allies and foes alike in awe. Yet even as Alexander basked in the glory of triumph, he understood a truth that transcended the battlefield. Conquest alone could never secure stability. Empires built on force are inherently fragile. Loyalty extracted through fear can evaporate the moment the conqueror falters. Macedonians and Greeks who had followed him for years still harbored resentment when he adopted Persian customs and attempted to integrate Eastern practices into his court. Persians, on the other hand, bristled at the imposition of foreign rulers and the upheaval of centuries-old traditions. Within his own army, whispers of unease circulated, especially among veterans who worried that Alexander's increasing fascination with Persian dress and ceremony threatened the cultural identity of Macedonia itself. Alexander, however, saw a vision that transcended petty grievances. He imagined an empire not simply dominated by Macedon, but harmonized with Persia, a fusion of cultures, loyalties, and traditions. His goal was audacious: to create a unified identity across the conquered lands, blending the best elements of East and West. Such unity could not rely solely on decrees or military enforcement. It required ceremony, symbolism, and a demonstration of inclusivity that might persuade subjects of all backgrounds that they belonged in this new world. The opportunity arose during Alexander's return to the Persian heartlands, when he arrived at the cosmopolitan city of Susa. Here, in one of the grandest urban centers of the ancient world, he conceived an idea unprecedented in scale and ambition: a mass wedding designed to bind Macedonian officers to Persian nobility. The goal was clear. By intertwining the families of the conquerors and the conquered, Alexander sought to forge loyalty through bonds of blood rather than fear. This was not a single matrimonial union, but dozens, a spectacle of social engineering intended to visually, politically, and emotionally cement the integration of his empire. The event would come to be known as the Wedding at Susa, a display of grandeur, diplomacy, and imperial propaganda all wrapped into one. Susa itself was a city carefully chosen for this purpose. Once the jewel of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, it had been a seat of wealth, culture, and power for centuries. Its palaces, gardens, and marble halls bore witness to the reigns of Darius and Xerxes, kings whose names alone had once inspired terror in the Greek imagination. By hosting the mass wedding here, Alexander not only leveraged the city's splendor, but symbolically claimed the legitimacy of the Persian throne. The architecture, the streets, the treasures, and the lingering aura of Persian royal authority provided a perfect stage for what he intended to be a transformative demonstration of unity. Preparations for the wedding began months in advance. Caravans arrived from across the empire, bringing silks, gold ornaments, spices, and perfumes. Craftsmen labored to construct ceremonial platforms, decorate halls, and ensure that the spectacle would surpass anything the world had seen. Macedonian officers were paired with Persian noblewomen selected for political significance. Alexander himself participated actively in the arrangements, making certain each match advanced his broader strategy. The marriages were designed not just to honor traditions, but to create a new ruling class loyal first and foremost to him. Yet beneath the surface glitter, tension simmered. Macedonians complained that they were being manipulated as pawns, coerced into alliances with families they had once fought against. Persian elites, for their part, were unsure whether the marriages signified genuine inclusion or merely the imposition of foreign domination. The symbolic power of marriage carried both the hope of reconciliation and the seeds of resentment. Among the participants, emotions ran high. Some embraced the prestige and connections marriage offered. Others resented the personal sacrifices demanded in service of Alexander's imperial vision. At the heart of the ceremony, Alexander himself reinforced the symbolic significance of the event through his personal unions. He was already married to Roxana of Bactria, a woman who represented loyalty, political alliance, and personal affection. Now, in Susa, he took two additional brides, Statira II, daughter of the recently defeated Darius III, and Persidas, daughter of the earlier Persian king Artaxerxes III. These marriages were carefully orchestrated to legitimize his authority, weaving him into the fabric of Persian royal lineage. He was no longer merely a conqueror. He now positioned himself as a rightful heir to Persia's throne, a ruler whose legitimacy derived from both conquest and dynastic integration. For the Macedonian officers, the weddings were complex affairs. Some welcomed the connections, recognizing the political and social advantages that came with marrying into Persian aristocracy. Others resisted, bound by loyalty to their homeland and resentful of the foreign customs imposed upon them. Many already had wives in Macedonia, creating personal dilemmas and domestic conflict. Persian brides faced their own struggles, caught between the past they had known and the uncertain future Alexander offered. For them, marriage meant survival, status, and the difficult task of reconciling old loyalties with the demands of their new ruler. In total, some 80 Macedonian officers were married to Persian noblewomen during the ceremony, a logistical and symbolic feat unparalleled in history. No previous Greek or Macedonian ruler had attempted such an integration on this scale. Each union was calculated to reinforce loyalty, build alliances, and construct a social network that would sustain Alexander's empire beyond the battlefield. Yet even as the golden halls glimmered, The incense swirled, and the music resounded. Underlying tensions remained. Macedonians feared cultural erasure, Persians feared subjugation, and Alexander alone bore the responsibility of holding these disparate ambitions together. When the wedding at Susa finally commenced, it unfolded as a theatrical masterpiece. Every aspect of the event was designed to dazzle and overwhelm. Tapestries adorned the palace walls, precious metals caught the light in a dazzling display, fragrant incense filled every hall, and musicians performed with precision to underscore the grandeur of the occasion. The sheer scale and splendor left participants awestruck. Yet even in this moment of spectacle, the deeper work of empire, of uniting diverse peoples under a single ruler, remained fragile and uncertain, dependent on the continued vision, charisma, and will of Alexander himself. The torchlight flickered across the polished marble of Susa, casting a golden haze over the grand palace halls. It caught on gilded ornaments, the glint of silk threads, and the polished surfaces of ceremonial vessels, creating the illusion that sunlight itself had been captured and imprisoned inside the banquet hall. Susa had witnessed countless royal rituals over the centuries, yet none had approached the scale, spectacle, or audacity of Alexander's plan. Even seasoned Persians and battle-hardened Macedonians, accustomed to grandeur, felt their breath catch at the sight. The hall alone could have inspired awe as its centerpiece. Enormous carpets in deep reds and vivid blues sprawled across the floors like rivers of molten color. Golden and silver couches lined the space in meticulous symmetry, awaiting dignitaries and officers, while musicians, drawn from Greek courts and Persian households, played an intricate fusion of melodies that intertwined the sonorities of two empires. Each note seemed calculated, echoing Alexander's vision of cultural integration and political harmony. Perfumes, the exotic fragrances of rose, myrrh, and saffron, wafted through the air, mingling with the scent of roasted meats, honey-drenched pastries, and freshly baked bread. The olfactory tapestry was as deliberate as the visual spectacle. Alexander understood that uniting an empire demanded more than law or ceremony. It required the senses themselves to be complicit in the illusion of order. Guests were seated according to careful design. Persian nobles sat beside Macedonian officers, courtiers from distant provinces alongside veterans of Asia Minor campaigns. Every placement was symbolic, a subtle reminder that this was no ordinary celebration but a demonstration of a social hierarchy now defined by allegiance to the king rather than blood alone. Even the drinking vessels were uniform, crafted from matching metals, a deliberate signal that status in Alexander's empire would not derive solely from ancestry. Then, in a procession that seemed to glide rather than march, the brides entered. Draped in Persian silks embroidered with gold thread and veiled with fine gauze from the looms of Susa, each step was measured, each gesture deliberate. Alexander's own brides, Statira II and Persidas, daughters of Persian kings defeated by Macedonian arms, moved with serene composure, their dignity emphasizing both continuity and conquest. Following them were the 80 Persian noblewomen chosen to marry Macedonian officers, their eyes a mixture of resolve, apprehension, and the faintest trace of defiance. The spectacle was at once political, emotional, and theatrical, a masterclass in symbolism designed to captivate, to impress, and to subtly command obedience through beauty. Macedonian soldiers watched with an odd mix of awe and unease. The spectacle, glittering and intoxicating, stirred admiration for Alexander's vision, yet sowed the seeds of confusion. Here were men who had endured deserts, river crossings, and pitched battles, now expected to take Persian wives, participate in unfamiliar ceremonies, and adopt customs foreign to their mountain upbringing. Persian nobles observed quietly, weighing honor against subjugation, understanding that while they gained access to the king's inner circle, it came at the price of autonomy and pride. When Alexander finally rose to speak, silence fell like a velvet curtain. He addressed the assembly not as a Macedonian king celebrating the spoils of conquest, but as the sovereign of a world reborn. His words praised harmony between Greek and Persian, Macedonian and Asiatic, presenting the wedding as the dawn of a new era in which differences would dissolve beneath loyalty to one throne. Idealistic and eloquent, his speech stirred hope among the receptive and suspicion among the skeptical. For a fleeting moment, the opulence, the torchlight, the music, and the perfumed air allowed the vision to feel possible, an empire united not by fear or force, but by shared bonds and human connection. The banquet that followed spanned days, a seemingly endless procession of feasts, toasts, dances, poetry, and gift-giving. Gold plates were filled and emptied, wines flowed like rivers, dancers performed acrobatic sequences choreographed to blend Greek forms with Persian flourish, and poets recited verses that wove together myths and legends of East and West. Every sensory detail reinforced the central theme. Alexander was not merely a conqueror. He was the architect of a new world order. Yet beneath the veneer of celebration, the central truth of the event remained stark. The wedding was never about love, at least not in the romantic sense. It was about control, influence, and engineering loyalty on a scale that no general, king, or emperor had attempted before. Alexander understood marriage as a tool more powerful than swords. By uniting Macedonian officers with Persian nobility, he tethered their fortunes, allegiances, and families to the stability of his empire. Children born from these unions would, ideally, embody the fusion of two cultures, providing future generations whose loyalty was inherent and whose identity was defined less by birthplace than by allegiance to the king. From a propaganda standpoint, the strategy was brilliant. Alexander presented himself not as a conqueror imposing foreign will, but as a legitimate Persian monarch, marrying the daughters of kings whose lineages conferred historical legitimacy. To the Persian elite, this was flattering and disarming. To Macedonians, unsettling and, for some, incomprehensible. The weddings also served a practical purpose. After years of relentless campaigning, many Macedonian veterans were restless, weary, and frustrated. The infusion of Persian officials into administrative roles further fueled discontent, as some soldiers felt overlooked or undervalued. Alexander's solution: bind the officers emotionally, financially, and socially to the eastern provinces. A Macedonian officer married into Persian nobility had something tangible to lose, whether estates, heirs, or honor. His loyalty now had a personal stake beyond duty to the crown or pride in his homeland. Despite the elegance and symbolism, resentment simmered beneath the surface. Macedonian officers struggled with the cultural imposition, with the wives they barely knew, and with the prospect of leaving their own families in Macedonia. Persian nobles, too, were conflicted. Prestige and access came at the price of subjugation and adaptation to foreign customs. Yet Alexander believed in the experiment absolutely. He thought unity could be forged through ceremony, that allegiance could be cultivated by bonds of marriage, that culture could be harmonized by spectacle. But reality quickly intruded upon idealism. As the glitter faded and the guests returned to their homes, the fractures Alexander had hoped to conceal became visible. Macedonians whispered grievances, questioning whether their king had forsaken them in favor of Persia. Some veterans, resentful and alienated, began to see themselves as outsiders in the empire they had helped build. Persian reactions were equally nuanced. While some valued the integration into Alexander's inner circle, others recognized that true power still lay with Macedonians and resented the subtle hierarchy of influence. Even Alexander's closest companions worried that his vision of fusion, however noble, was becoming increasingly detached from practical governance. In the months following the weddings, tensions mounted. Macedonian soldiers found themselves emotionally entangled with Persian families they scarcely knew, expected to adopt unfamiliar customs, and faced with the dislocation of homes, loyalties, and social norms. Persians, though outwardly compliant, maintained private doubts about their diminished agency. Alexander's vision of a hybrid civilization, a world where identity was defined by allegiance rather than origin, collided with the stubborn realities of cultural prejudice, personal attachment, and the inertia of centuries of animosity. The first major crisis came swiftly. In 324 BCE, shortly after the weddings, Alexander announced plans to send elderly Macedonian veterans home and replace them with Persian soldiers, aiming to institutionalize the fusion across the empire. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Troops erupted in anger, accusing their king of abandoning them in favor of foreigners. They shouted that Alexander had forsaken Macedon, becoming instead the king of Persia. For Alexander, whose devotion to his vision was personal as much as strategic, the mutiny felt like a profound betrayal. His response combined both fury and vulnerability. He publicly wept, embraced his soldiers, and proclaimed a symbolic brotherhood of man, attempting to remind his men that loyalty and unity transcended heritage. It was a beautiful moment, theatrical and sincere, yet also fragile. Despite his brilliance and authority, Alexander discovered that allegiance could not simply be decreed. Unity required consent, trust, and shared belief, qualities far harder to manufacture than the pageantry of Susa could suggest. The wedding, for all its grandeur, had revealed both the promise and the peril of his imperial strategy. It demonstrated the power of spectacle, the utility of symbolism, and the potential for marriage to enforce social cohesion. But it also exposed the limits of charisma and ceremony in the face of entrenched cultural identities. Even as he attempted reconciliation, Alexander understood that the weddings had not eradicated the divisions within his empire. Macedonians remained wary, Persians cautious, and underlying tensions persisted, waiting for the smallest spark to ignite. The Susa celebration, magnificent though it was, became a reminder that no spectacle, no matter how dazzling, could entirely reconcile centuries of conquest with the lived realities of those conquered. The empire may have appeared united in the torchlight and gold of the palace halls, but beyond the glitter, the bonds of loyalty remained tentative, fragile, and fiercely contested. The golden brilliance of Susa, once a testament to Alexander's grand ambition, now felt like a distant memory. The torchlight that had shimmered across silk, marble, and gilded vessels was extinguished in the minds of those who had participated, replaced by a stark awareness of reality. The wounds Alexander had opened, between his vision and the empire he ruled, had widened, leaving raw, exposed divisions. The months that followed the wedding of Susa were fraught with tension as the young king pressed harder than ever to solidify his dream of a unified empire. He imagined a society born from the marriages, where children of Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen would grow into a ruling class unbound by ethnicity, a hybrid generation loyal solely to him. The vision seemed perfect in its logic, almost inevitable to Alexander, yet fate, as it so often did, intervened with cruel precision. From the very beginning, cracks appeared. Many Macedonian officers treated their Persian wives with cold detachment. Some ignored them entirely, regarding the marriages as temporary obligations to be endured rather than partnerships to be cherished. Others maintained the semblance of compliance while continuing their private lives as bachelors, keeping their hearts and homes tethered to Macedon rather than Persia. Persian families, who had hoped for true alliances, soon recognized the emptiness behind the ceremony's pageantry. Their daughters were treated not as partners in governance or shared destiny, but as instruments in a political experiment, admired, feared, or disregarded, but never embraced. Bitterness festered where unity had been promised. Alexander's grand social engineering was beginning to unravel, long before the empire itself faced existential challenges. The real catastrophe arrived suddenly, brutally, with Alexander's untimely death in Babylon in 323 BCE. Barely 32 years old, the conqueror of continents, the orchestrator of the most ambitious imperial experiment the world had ever seen, was gone. The empire he had envisioned, synchronized, harmonious, and integrated, suddenly lacked a steward. Those who were supposed to carry his dream forward, The Macedonian generals and officers had never truly believed in it themselves. They were men of ambition, accustomed to command and conquest, not delicate socio-political engineering. One of the first actions taken in the vacuum of power was a swift dismantling of the Susa marriages. Freed from Alexander's iron will, the Macedonian officers dissolved their unions with Persian wives almost immediately. Some did so quietly returning to Macedon to rejoin previous families or reclaim long-neglected estates. Others acted openly, flaunting disdain as they repudiated their new spouses. The 80 marriages that had symbolized the fusion of two worlds evaporated like mist at sunrise, leaving humiliation, heartbreak, and a stark lesson in the limits of power. Alexander's dream of unity, crafted in silk, gold, and ceremony, died alongside him. The Persian brides faced an uncertain and often perilous fate. Many were noble daughters from the highest echelons of Persian society, women whose lives had been upended by conquest and then manipulated into marriage as a political instrument. Some returned home, shunned or dismissed by their families who had counted on a genuine alliance. Others were abandoned entirely, left adrift in an empire that no longer recognized their value. Alexander's own wives, Statira II and Persidas, suffered even grimmer consequences. In the bloody scramble for succession, both were murdered, likely on the orders of Roxana, Alexander's first wife, who sought to secure her position and the inheritance of her unborn son. The glittering celebrations of Susa became a bitter prelude to murder and betrayal. Within a year, the mass wedding that had symbolized possibility now stood as a testament to the fragility of Alexander's vision. The empire's generals sought power, not cultural fusion. Macedonians desired sovereignty, not hybrid identity. The dream of an integrated world, born of strategy and spectacle, had fractured as completely as the marriages themselves. Susa, once the stage of golden celebration, now became a silent monument to an experiment the ancient world was unready to embrace. Historians of later centuries would interpret the wedding of Susa in dramatically different ways. Some praised Alexander's genius, his audacity in attempting what no ruler before him had dared, to bind former enemies and allies alike into a social and political structure based on cooperation, loyalty, and shared future. Others viewed the mass weddings as a cautionary tale, evidence that even the most brilliant king could be outpaced by the stubborn realities of human nature. Macedonian soldiers, once devoted to their hero, felt alienated by his Persianization. Persian nobles, though flattered by gestures of recognition, knew that the real levers of power remained firmly in Macedonian hands. And the officers, coerced into unions against their inclination, carried silent resentment, their loyalty to Alexander tested but never fully transferred to his vision of fusion. Yet, despite the evident failure of the marriages, the experiment left an enduring legacy. Alexander had pushed the boundaries of identity, class, and empire, daring to imagine a world in which Macedonians and Persians could produce heirs of dual heritage, symbolic of a unified empire. It was a visionary experiment, a gamble against centuries of entrenched prejudice and cultural inertia. While the empire fractured almost immediately after his death, the seeds of fusion survived in subtler, unintended ways. Greek language, ideas, and architecture intermingled with local customs, creating hybrid cities, commerce networks, and cultural exchanges. Alexandria and other foundation cities became lasting centers of multicultural interaction, proof that Alexander's vision, while imperfectly realized, had touched the world in ways marriage could not. The weddings of Susa, then, are remembered not as failures alone, but as emblematic of Alexander's audacity, dazzling, daring, and ultimately constrained by human nature. They illuminate the tension between conquest and assimilation, ambition and realism, symbolism and practical governance. Alexander conquered empires with his sword, but he could not conquer hearts, allegiance, or centuries of entrenched cultural identity. His brilliance was both celebrated and constrained by the immutable limits of human society. As one chapter of Alexander's life closed, the world of Sparta opened, entirely different in ethos, yet similarly demanding of its young citizens. At 7 years old, a Spartan boy was ripped from the arms of his mother and handed over to the Agoge, the state-run system designed to shape, harden, and claim him. There was no gentleness, no measured transition into adolescence, only the raw severing of childhood bonds. One day he belonged to family, hearth, and maternal care. The next, he belonged wholly to the state, where the needs of Sparta outweighed all individual desires. His cries, the grief of his mother, and the silent resignation of his father marked the brutal reality of Spartan upbringing, a rite of passage meant to forge warriors rather than men of leisure. The Agoge would teach obedience through discipline, endurance through suffering, and loyalty through shared deprivation. The boy, stripped of comfort, ritualized family, and maternal protection, was now a member of a collective identity that subordinated the individual entirely to the needs of the polis. Survival meant conformity, failure meant death or exile. Unlike Alexander's vision, which attempted to engineer unity through bonds of blood and ceremony, Sparta demanded unity through unyielding coercion and rigor. Every Spartan youth was a living instrument, honed by ritualized pain and relentless training, molded into a soldier who internalized the values of the city-state above all else. The psychological intensity of the Agoge was immediate. 7-year-old boys endured physical trials, deliberate humiliation, and constant monitoring. They slept under harsh conditions, ate scant rations, and learned lessons not from gentle guidance, but from peer rivalry and direct punishment. Even at this tender age, the Spartans understood that emotional resilience was inseparable from martial discipline. Where Alexander's empire struggled to reconcile personal loyalty with state ambition, the Spartan system demanded absolute absorption into the collective identity. Individual desire was irrelevant. Obedience and endurance defined worth. For the boy, the transition was overwhelming. Homesickness, fear, and grief mingled with nascent pride as he began to understand that his fate was inseparable from the city's survival. The Agoge would strip him of childhood illusions and replace them with the hardened knowledge that Sparta was eternal, that every citizen was expendable, and that personal suffering was a currency in the creation of a formidable military culture. Where Alexander had wielded marriage and ceremony to manipulate loyalty, Sparta wielded discipline, pain, and communal indoctrination to achieve it. Both approaches sought stability, yet the tools, logic, and human consequences were starkly different. By the time boys emerged from the early years of the Agoge into adolescence, they had undergone more than physical conditioning. They had been taught hierarchy, vigilance, and endurance of pain. They had learned secrecy, cunning, and the value of the collective over the individual. Every scar, every humiliation, and every challenge was an investment in Sparta's military hegemony. The psychological imprint of these early years would define them for life. Resilience forged in adversity, loyalty cultivated through hardship, identity rooted in the polis rather than family. Pride, in Sparta, was meaningless when measured against the will of the state. From the moment a boy was taken from his family, all personal attachments, comforts, and even the innocence of childhood were obliterated. He was no longer an individual in the modern sense. He had become a tool, a fragment of the machinery that was Sparta itself. The boy's new home was a communal barracks, a vast, austere structure filled with other children, strangers who would become brothers not through affection, but through shared hardship. They slept together on coarse mats, gathering and tearing them by hand each night, shivering through bitter winters under nothing more than a thin cloak. Comfort was deliberately denied. Every element of their environment, from the food to the bedding to the physical space itself, was carefully designed to teach endurance, resilience, and obedience. The food, as in every detail of the Agoge, was minimal. Portions were small, barely enough to keep a boy alive, a constant gnawing hunger pressing him toward cunning, initiative, and ingenuity. This was no oversight. It was intentional pedagogy. Hunger became a tool, a teacher, sharpening instinct, encouraging theft, and testing cleverness. To steal was not a sin in itself. It was expected. The sin was in failing, in being caught, in revealing weakness. Punishment followed inevitably, not for the act of taking, but for the error, for revealing that a boy had failed the first lesson of Spartan survival: discretion. The instructors, known as paedonomoi, were relentless and unforgiving. They offered no comfort, no praise, no reassurance. Their mission was to mold boys into human weapons, capable of withstanding any pain, enduring any humiliation, and controlling any fear. Crying was scorned. Endurance in silence was exalted. To smile through suffering was the ultimate sign of worth. Each boy learned that his value was measured by his composure under duress, by his ability to absorb pain without complaint, and by his capacity to act decisively without hesitation. Yet, even in this crucible of cruelty, a paradoxical bond emerged. Brotherhood, forged not by warmth or love but by shared adversity, became the psychological heart of the Agoge. Boys learned to rely on one another instinctively, understanding that survival depended on collective vigilance as much as individual skill. This bond, formed in the darkness of the barracks and the frost of winter, would later become the cornerstone of Spartan military cohesion, a unity more profound than family or friendship. Childhood, as the modern world understands it, simply did not exist in Sparta. Each day revolved around relentless physical trials, ceaseless psychological conditioning, and ritualized exposure to hardship. The boys ran barefoot year-round, their feet hardening into resilient, calloused pads capable of traversing rock-strewn terrain, scorched earth, and icy streams alike. They wrestled until their bodies bled, sparred with wooden weapons designed to crush fingers and wrists, and underwent drills so exhausting that collapse seemed inevitable. Yet falling was never an excuse. Shame awaited any boy who yielded. In Sparta, endurance was proof of worth, and every pang of hunger, every lash, every bruise reinforced the lesson. Survival required cunning, resilience, and obedience. Food remained insufficient by design, a constant companion and motivator. The daily ration, a thin broth, a small hunk of bread, and whatever could be procured through stealth, was an instrument of education. Boys learned to steal skillfully, quietly, and without detection. Success brought admiration among peers. Failure brought brutal public punishment, a spectacle meant to sharpen resolve. These exercises trained much more than hunger management. They taught boys to read environments, to move silently, to calculate risks, and to anticipate consequences. A successful theft from the storeroom mirrored the precision of a future infiltration behind enemy lines. Hierarchy compounded the cruelty. Older boys wielded authority over younger ones, enforcing obedience and dominance. Humiliation, public reprimand, and forced tasks were the instruments of social engineering, designed to erode ego and cultivate absolute respect for authority. Speech was constrained. Wandering tongues and idle chatter were punished. Silence was equated with strength, brevity with wisdom, and measured speech became a defining Spartan trait. From this discipline emerged the legendary laconic style, terse, deliberate, precise, a reflection of years spent internalizing restraint, endurance, and focus. Yet even in this environment of control and deprivation, human adaptability surfaced. Shared suffering bred loyalty and cooperation. Boys learned to anticipate each other's movements, to act as a coordinated unit, and to read subtle gestures and signs. Bonds formed in necessity, and these bonds later became the backbone of Spartan military strategy. Every shared hardship, every act of stealth and cunning, every narrowly avoided punishment wove a web of trust and interdependence among them. But the Agoge was only just beginning. The lessons of endurance, stealth, and obedience were merely the foundation for far darker, more demanding trials that awaited. One of the paradoxical elements of Spartan pedagogy was the duality of theft. Boys were forbidden to steal openly, yet punished only if caught. This contradiction was purposeful. It taught them strategy, cunning, and precision. Survival required skill, stealth, and decisiveness. Through repeated exercises in theft, snatching food from kitchens, bedding materials, or even the possessions of peers and instructors, the boys honed not only dexterity but judgment, timing, and spatial awareness. Each successful theft, executed without detection, became a badge of honor, proof of instinctive intelligence and daring. Punishment, too, carried layered lessons. A boy caught stealing was beaten not for the theft itself, but for failure, for allowing opportunity to expose weakness. The pain was acute, but the shame it delivered was even more powerful. Through this, the boys internalized the concept that failure was intolerable and survival demanded constant vigilance. Some dared further, attempting to steal livestock or pilfer supplies from Helot quarters. These missions carried mortal risk, as the Helots bore deep resentment toward Spartan children. A misstep could result in severe injury or even death. Success, however, conferred prestige and reputation. Thus, even minor theft became training for life and death scenarios they would encounter as warriors. Beyond the hunger, physical hardship, and theft, boys faced psychological trials. They were subjected to controlled isolation, removed from peers for days at a time to test endurance, judgment, and resilience. Solitude, in Spartan pedagogy, was a crucible. It stripped the boy of dependence, revealing character, resourcefulness, and fortitude. This isolation was not reflective or meditative. It was relentless and psychologically exacting. They learned to survive entirely on their own, to adapt, to make instantaneous decisions, and to maintain composure in the absence of guidance. The agoge, in essence, was a meticulously designed system for producing human weapons. Every aspect of a boy's life — hunger, exposure, pain, hierarchy, and psychological pressure — was interwoven into a grand strategy to forge loyalty, obedience, and martial competence. It was both education and ritualized brutality, designed to obliterate personal identity and replace it with unwavering devotion to Sparta. The state claimed them completely, leaving no room for weakness, sentimentality, or personal ambition that could conflict with the needs of the polis. In time, the boys would progress to even greater challenges: coordinated group exercises, live combat simulations, and survival in the wilderness. Each stage built upon the last, intensifying physical hardship, sharpening mental acuity, and deepening psychological resilience. Hunger, fear, and pain became tools to cultivate stealth, initiative, and self-reliance. These exercises prepared them for a future that demanded precise timing, tactical insight, and a capacity for calculated cruelty. Eventually, the agoge would also introduce direct combat training against peers, teaching controlled aggression and teamwork. The boys learned to fight not just as individuals, but as elements of a collective force. Observation, anticipation, and instinctive cooperation became second nature. Their bonds, forged through shared suffering and mutual reliance, were reinforced by constant competition, challenge, and the looming threat of failure. Each trial, whether in barracks or field, honed their skills for the battlefield that awaited them in adulthood. As they grew, Spartan boys transitioned from surviving hunger and harsh discipline to mastering warcraft, strategy, and survival under extreme conditions. Lessons in stealth, theft, and cunning evolved into training for reconnaissance, ambush, and silent elimination. The most dangerous stage came when boys were removed entirely from the safety of the barracks and sent into controlled wilderness exercises. Here, survival meant sourcing food, navigating terrain, and avoiding detection, lessons that blurred the boundary between game, ritual, and life-or-death reality. It was in these moments of extreme isolation that the boy's psyche was tested most ruthlessly. Each mistake could be fatal. Each success reinforced the value of cunning, patience, and control. The boys learned that fear was to be analyzed, hunger to be manipulated, and pain endured without complaint. They became shadows themselves, silent, calculating, efficient, preparing them for roles as the most feared and disciplined warriors in Greece. Even as they endured, they were learning the ultimate paradox of Sparta, that freedom lay entirely in obedience, strength through shared suffering, and life through constant vigilance. Survival demanded not just physical skill, but moral adaptation, emotional suppression, and strategic thinking. The Agoge shaped not just warriors, but individuals whose identity, loyalty, and value were inseparable from the state. Every element, deprivation, hierarchy, isolation, and punishment, was a deliberate, interconnected strategy to produce soldiers capable of ruthless efficiency and unwavering commitment. In Sparta, the boy's transformation was total. By adolescence, he was no longer a child in the conventional sense. He was a product of a system that had sculpted every aspect of his mind, body, and spirit. Hunger, pain, fear, stealth, obedience, camaraderie, and cunning were no longer lessons. They were instinct. The Agoge's purpose had been fulfilled. A generation of warriors, bound to the state, resilient, lethal, and unflinchingly loyal, forged in the fires of deprivation and trial, ready to defend the polis at any cost. In Sparta, the ultimate objective of the Agoge was not merely to produce soldiers. It was to craft shadows, individuals capable of surviving completely alone, yet operating as part of an unbroken chain of loyalty to the state. Isolation, in the Spartan system, was a crucible of unparalleled severity. A boy thrust into solitude was stripped of all instruction, all guidance, and all companionship. No schedule dictated his day. No adult provided nourishment, warmth, or reassurance. Survival depended entirely on the skills he had honed during earlier trials in stealth, cunning, and endurance. Each moment of the day became a test. The frigid nights pressed down like weight. Hunger clawed relentlessly at the belly, and fear was a constant, inescapable companion. The wilderness surrounding Sparta was alive with threats. Wolves, foxes, and wild dogs patrolled the outskirts, their eyes glinting in the darkness. The Helot population, enslaved by Sparta, bore deep resentment for their captors. Any encounter with them could turn deadly in an instant. Isolation was not staged in a controlled environment with predictable outcomes. It was survival imposed in unpredictable terrain. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig, and every shadow in the night could herald danger. The boy learned, almost instinctively, to move silently, to anticipate danger, and to interpret every subtle sound and motion as a potential threat. The wind became a teacher, carrying signals of approaching enemies or obstacles. The night itself, long and oppressive, revealed lessons that no words could convey. Remain unseen, remain vigilant, or perish. Yet isolation was as much a test of the mind as of the body. Boys who panicked exposed themselves as children still tied to fear rather than discipline. Those who acted recklessly revealed impatience and inadequacy. The ones who survived, who emerged intact from the night and its terrors, understood self-reliance on a level that few other societies demanded of fully grown men, let alone adolescents. These survivors returned to their barracks quieter, colder, and infinitely more observant, their senses sharpened and their confidence in themselves tempered like steel. Spartan elders intentionally shrouded the isolation experience in secrecy. Details were not recorded, and boys were instructed never to speak of what they had endured. Each trial was unique, intensely personal, and often haunting for life. The elders believed that a youth who had confronted the world alone would never fear an enemy army. However, isolation was only the precursor to something far darker and more exacting. Stealth, vigilance, and endurance were essential, but Sparta required more. To serve the polis truly, a boy had to learn a skill that no ordinary society could condone. He had to learn to kill, not in open combat, but in silence from the shadows. The Agoge did not merely prepare warriors for the phalanx. It prepared them for the secret, lethal tasks whispered of in Spartan legend. Boys were trained to stalk enemies, to operate alone or in small groups, and to execute targets with precision and detachment. Killing was not presented as moral contemplation. It was framed as civic duty, a necessary skill in the survival of Sparta itself. The instructions were never explicit. Boys were not told plainly, "Today you will learn to kill." Instead, lethal skills were woven into exercises, drills, and shadow games. Every lesson of stealth, every exercise in moving without sound, and every encounter with the wilderness served as preparation for this chilling truth. The boys learned to walk lightly, distributing weight so that dry branches would not betray their movement. They learned how to strike human targets quietly, to incapacitate quickly, and to aim for the vulnerabilities of the body, the throat, lungs, kidneys. Anatomical precision was drilled into them repeatedly. Demonstrations were made using animals or, in extreme cases, helot slaves condemned for disobedience. Modern sensibilities recoil at this, yet in Spartan eyes, this was refinement and education, the creation of warriors capable of acting without hesitation or moral conflict. Short daggers became the instruments of instruction. Unlike the long spears of the hoplite phalanx, these weapons were designed for ambush, for close-quarters lethality, for slipping between ribs and extinguishing life before a sound could escape. Instructors drilled the motions endlessly, a hand to cover the mouth, the knife to the target, repetition until muscle memory rendered hesitation impossible. Speed, precision, and psychological conditioning were inseparable. The boys learned that hesitation endangered not only themselves but the entire city. In Sparta, doubt was fatal, obedience absolute. Night exercises accelerated the transformation. Boys were sent into darkness to pursue instructors posing as enemy scouts. A misstep meant harsh punishment. Success earned only sparing acknowledgement, the smallest reinforcement for what had become a near-constant state of tension. Over time, these lessons reshaped the boys' perception of morality. Killing became not crime, but competence. Stealth was valor. Silence was strength. Among the more secretive, whispered rituals of the Cryptia, Sparta's covert service, these skills were tested in live operations, often against the helot population, consolidating fear, loyalty, and lethal capacity in one integrated system. The next stage of the Agoge tested survival in its rawest, most unforgiving form. Boys were forced into the wilderness, alone or in small groups, with nothing but a knife, a cloak, and their wits. Here, survival was not a drill, it was existential. The mountains, forests, and river valleys surrounding Sparta were harsh, rugged, and full of natural and human threats. Weather ranged from scorching summers to freezing winters. Predators roamed freely, and helots patrolled hidden paths with suspicion and animosity. Boys were not only required to survive, they were required to thrive, to improvise, to anticipate threats, and to use their environment to their advantage. Tracking was an essential skill. Boys learned to read the minutiae of the natural world, footprints in mud, the age of tracks, the direction of movement. They learned to hunt without large weapons or noisy traps, to follow prey silently, to discern human presence from animal. Birds in flight became signals. Wind direction revealed potential danger. Clouds suggested imminent weather. Shelter construction tested ingenuity. Boys created low, hidden structures from branches, stones, and earth, designed for concealment rather than comfort. Smoke from a fire could betray their position, so they learned to insulate themselves with natural materials and body heat. Water was located, not supplied. They identified underground springs, collected dew, and tracked riverbeds for shallow pools. Failure to do so could mean dehydration and death. Foraging extended beyond physical endurance into botanical mastery. Boys were taught to distinguish edible roots, berries, and herbs from poisonous lookalikes. One misstep could induce vomiting, fever, or even fatality. The Agoge ensured that mistakes were remembered permanently. A Spartan who could not differentiate life from death in nature was useless on the battlefield. Hunger, fatigue, and exposure forged resilience. while errors instilled caution and respect for the environment. The psychological dimension of wilderness training was as vital as the physical. Alone in hostile terrain, a boy confronted his deepest fears, impulses, and weaknesses. Panic revealed immaturity. Arrogance revealed overconfidence. Only discipline, observation, and quiet cunning ensured survival. By enduring the wilderness, Spartan youths developed the capacity to operate behind enemy lines, to move silently, to resist exhaustion, and to make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure. The lessons were uncompromising. Self-reliance, vigilance, and deadly competence were paramount. In addition to survival, stealth and lethality became embedded habits. Boys trained in silence, moving like shadows, reacting instantly, observing without being observed. Even when returned to the barracks, they carried lessons from the wilderness: awareness of sound, subtle reading of human behavior, and instinctive calculation of danger. Each boy was a product of iterative conditioning. Hunger, hardship, isolation, and lethal skill reinforced continuously, layering survival instinct upon stealth, stealth upon loyalty, and loyalty upon obedience. In Sparta, failure was punished swiftly and publicly, teaching boys not just physical resilience, but mental toughness. Every misstep, hesitation, or mistake was amplified by public scrutiny, ensuring that lessons were internalized deeply. Endurance and cunning became intertwined with social expectation. A boy's reputation within the barracks could rise or fall based on his resourcefulness, his ability to remain unseen, and his decisiveness in critical moments. Peer pressure and mentorship reinforced these lessons. Older boys evaluated the younger, perpetuating a hierarchy of skill, cunning, and ruthlessness. As boys matured, survival exercises evolved. Theft, stealth, and wilderness proficiency expanded into ambush training, reconnaissance, and covert operations. Each trial required flawless execution under risk of exposure or failure. Hunger, exhaustion, and the threat of capture created conditions analogous to warfare. These years forged young men capable of acting with precision and detachment, making decisions under pressure and neutralizing threats before they were fully realized. Each boy became a node in a larger network of skill, intelligence, and lethal capacity, trained to operate alone or as part of a coordinated effort. In the final stages of the Agoge, the youth were expected to synthesize all previous training: survival, stealth, endurance, observation, and lethal efficiency. Success meant they had become shadows, capable of surviving anywhere, responding to threats with immediacy, and acting for the greater good of Sparta without hesitation. Failure was fatal in both perception and consequence. Through this relentless, unforgiving system, the Agoge transformed children into warriors whose loyalty, lethality, and resilience were inseparable from the polis itself. The Spartan system was unyielding. It demanded perfection, endurance, and moral recalibration. Through hunger, isolation, stealth, and lethal instruction, the boys learned that survival was predicated on skill, observation, and loyalty to the state. By the time they reached manhood, they were no longer merely individuals. They were weapons, shadows, and instruments of Sparta's will. The Agoge had accomplished its mission. Boys had become men capable of withstanding extremes of hunger, cold, fear, and moral ambiguity, ready to defend their city with silence, cunning, and lethal precision. In Sparta, a boy who survived the Agoge was never simply a soldier. By the time he emerged, he had been meticulously reshaped into a living weapon, self-sufficient, deadly, and utterly loyal to the state. But the true apex of Spartan training was something even more secretive, more feared, and far more transformative than all previous trials: the Cryptia. Among all the rites and tests imposed upon Spartan youth, none carried such secrecy or inspired such dread as the Cryptia. It was the shadowy initiation that selected only the strongest, most cunning, and most unhesitatingly obedient boys to serve the state as instruments of violence and control. To outsiders and historians, The Cryptia is among the most chilling institutions ever devised. The initiation into the Cryptia began without ceremony. A boy would be summoned quietly, often in the dead of night, and given only a cloak and a dagger. He would vanish from the structured life of the barracks, leaving behind friends, family, and all traces of normal existence. Those who witnessed his departure never spoke of it. Those who did not see him leave never asked. For months, sometimes years, the initiate became invisible, accountable only to the Spartan elders. He became a ghost moving through the landscape of Sparta and its surrounding territory, a silent enforcer of the city-state's will. The primary purpose of the Cryptia was brutal and pragmatic. It was a mechanism of surveillance, suppression, and control over the Helot population. The Helots vastly outnumbered the Spartans. They tilled the land, fed the army, and sustained the city's daily life. Yet they were perpetually viewed with suspicion. Sparta lived in fear of revolt, and the Cryptia functioned as the sharp edge of this fear. The boys stalked the countryside under cover of darkness, hiding by day, observing villages, monitoring Helot behavior, and executing any perceived threats with cold precision. There was no oversight, no mercy, and no rules beyond efficiency and stealth. A target might be struck on an isolated road or in the fields at night. These killings were not random acts of cruelty. They were calculated, systematic, and designed to instill terror, ensuring that rebellion remained unthinkable. But the Cryptia was more than a weapon of oppression. It was a crucible of psychological transformation. Isolated from peers, forbidden from forming emotional bonds, and forced to take lives alone, the initiates were remade. They learned to live invisibly, to navigate terrain with instinctive awareness, and to confront the most intimate form of violence, killing without the adrenaline and chaos of the battlefield. The elders believed that a Spartan who had learned to execute in silence, under the cover of night, would never fear an army or an enemy again. Every act of stealth, every life taken, reinforced obedience and ruthlessness. Yet these lessons left deep psychological marks. Some boys returned from the Cryptia hardened into instruments of absolute loyalty. Others emerged hollowed, haunted by the acts they had been forced to commit. A few never returned at all, their absence a silent warning to those who survived. For those who did survive, the trials did not end. Even after mastering stealth and lethal precision, the next stage tested a youth's capacity to dominate fear itself. Spartan elders believed that a warrior who trembled at darkness, uncertainty, or death was dangerous, a liability to the polis. To conquer fear, they devised secret rites that blurred the line between psychological conditioning and spiritual ordeal. Chief among these was the rite of night and silence. During this period, initiates were sent into the wilderness alone for days, sometimes weeks, without fire, food, or guidance. No sound could escape their lips. They could not sing, hum, or chant, even as a comfort to steady their nerves. Silence was absolute, enforced not by orders, but by the relentless weight of isolation. In these dark stretches, every instinct was honed. A boy had to stay hidden by day, for helots or wild animals could kill a lone youth on sight. By night, he was expected to move, observe, and train without pause. Every footstep, every shadow, and every sound became part of his education. He memorized the contours of the terrain so completely that he could navigate by touch and intuition alone. The goal was to dissolve fear itself, not merely to endure it, but to command it, to render it powerless in the face of any danger. The elders amplified these lessons with staged threats. Rustling leaves, distant screams, snapping branches, and fleeting shadows reminded the initiate that peril was omnipresent. Direct attacks were rare. The fear itself was the instructor. The boy learned to remain still, silent, and unbroken, no matter the provocation. Those who failed this stage were removed from the Cryptia. Those who mastered it returned transformed. They moved with predator-like confidence, undisturbed by sudden noise, shadows, or darkness. Fear was no longer a reaction. It became a tool under the control of the Spartan warrior's mind. The final and most definitive trial awaited only after years of preparation. It was a test that combined everything learned in the Agoge and the Cryptia: survival, stealth, obedience, lethal skill, and mastery over fear. This ultimate rite was known simply as the hunt. Unlike previous exercises, this hunt was not a simulation. There were no instructors, no staged threats, no symbolic targets. The youth received only a cloak, a dagger, and a vague directive: eliminate a designated threat to Sparta. Often, the target was a helot suspected of rebellion, strong, cunning, and dangerous. This was a test of predator against prey, requiring all the skill, patience, and ruthlessness the boy had accumulated over years of training. The hunt was a study in stalking, anticipation, and precision. The boy observed the target, tracked movements, predicted habits, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. A single misstep, a single cry or sound, could alert the target, other helots, or the environment itself, turning the hunter into the hunted. Every element of the landscape, the trees, rocks, wind direction, and terrain, became tools or obstacles. Survival instincts honed during years of isolation and wilderness training merged with lethal skill to create a singular focus: completion of the mission without detection or failure. Success in the hunt brought no fanfare, no accolades, and no ceremony. Spartan culture valued action over recognition. The elders offered only grim acknowledgement, a nod, a brief word, a silent affirmation of the boy's passage into full manhood. The youth had severed the final ties to childhood and human softness. He had killed not in the chaos of battle, not under the protection of comrades, but in the intimate, solitary precision that Sparta valued above all else. Failure, by contrast, was final. Some boys were slain by the helot they hunted. Others were quietly removed from Spartan society, erased from memory as if they had never existed. Sparta had no tolerance for incompleteness. Half-made warriors were liabilities. Fully forged instruments of the state were the ideal. Those who survived the hunt emerged as Spartiates, men whose identities were inseparable from the polis itself. Childhood, family, personal fear, and hesitation had been excised, replaced by unwavering loyalty, lethal skill, and psychological resilience. They became the ultimate expression of Spartan power, unseen, lethal, and entirely devoted to the state. These men could operate behind enemy lines, execute orders with silent precision, endure extremes of environment, and suppress any fear that might compromise their mission. The secret rites of Spartan youth were designed not to create ordinary humans, nor even conventional warriors. They were engineered to produce living weapons, men who could endure isolation, hunger, exposure, and terror, who could kill in silence, and who could navigate darkness, wilderness, and danger without faltering. Obedience, precision, and loyalty were absolute. Hesitation, compassion, or softness were purged from their character. From the initial separation from family to the final hunt, each stage stripped away layers of human attachment, fear, and hesitation. By the time a boy returned from these trials, he was no longer a child, nor even merely a soldier. He was a living embodiment of Sparta itself. Through the Cryptia and the secret rites, the Spartans achieved a terrifying perfection. Every skill taught, every test endured, every death witnessed or inflicted reinforced the city-state's ideals: absolute obedience, unbreakable courage, lethal efficiency, and enduring vigilance. The boys became shadows, predators, and instruments of policy and control, existing not for themselves, but for the survival and dominance of Sparta. The Agoge, the Cryptia, and the hunt together formed a continuum of transformation so complete that the resulting Spartiates were simultaneously human and weapon, individual and extension of the polis. Even modern historians, reading accounts of the Cryptia, are struck by its dual nature. On one hand, it is a method of brutal social control, a systematic oppression of the helot population that ensured Spartan dominance through fear. On the other hand, it was a psychological engineering marvel, a system that reshaped human beings into living embodiments of state ideals. Pain, deprivation, solitude, violence, and fear were used not arbitrarily, but with a calculated purpose, layering skill upon skill, instinct upon instinct, obedience upon lethality. In Sparta, the individual existed only as a tool of the collective, and the Krypteia was the apex of this philosophy. By the time a Spartan youth completed the final hunt, he had passed through years of carefully orchestrated hardship, separation from family, exposure to hunger, training in stealth, enforced silence, psychological duress, wilderness survival, isolation, and finally, sanctioned killing. Each stage reinforced the previous, creating an unbroken chain of conditioning designed to produce the ultimate warrior. The resulting Spartiates were instruments of state policy, terrifyingly effective soldiers, and unwavering enforcers of Spartan authority. They had been molded to endure, to kill, and to serve without question or hesitation. In the end, the secret rites of Spartan youth, culminating in the Krypteia and the hunt, were not intended to nurture human qualities of compassion, individuality, or even moral judgment. They were designed to create perfection within the confines of Spartan ideals: discipline, stealth, lethality, and absolute loyalty. In this mission, the Agoge and the Krypteia succeeded with chilling precision. Spartan youth emerged as living weapons, shadows walking among men, instruments of control and survival. They were Sparta made flesh, a terrifying embodiment of the city-state's vision of martial excellence.